It's Saturday. It is 9:30. It is the 13th day of February. We've got 24 hours left to get me a Valentine's present. And it's time for me to stop complaining and actually talk about a role-playing game I actually like. What? There are games like you like? There are plenty of games I like. Or at least hold in a fond, nostalgic place in my rapidly diminishing memory because I'm old. So today, let's talk about a game that is very near and dear to my heart and will always have a special place. And that is Steve Jackson Games, the generic universal role-playing system, or better known as GURPS. Not only because for what it was, what it became, but because how it changed the industry, and the fact that is, as far as I know, the only game company to ever be rated by the Secret Service. So, GURPS is a point-based, build what you want based upon the genre game. It is not the first point-based system. It's not the last point-based system. It's not even the best point-based system. But at the time, when it first came out, it was very simple. And there was something, the idea of being a generic universal game. A game where you could run any genre. And in the back of other people's minds, play a game where you could play anything. I mean, which would definitely be called, back in our day, the beer and pretzel role-playing game. The idea that you could do a game and have one guy playing a D&D fighter, another guy playing a Starship Trooper, and a third guy playing the Flash. These games existed. They were usually very weird Saturday games, beer and pretzel games, just a bunch of guys getting together and just sort of role-playing whatever, vaguely in D&D, with all sorts of weird shit. I mean, I did play in a D&D game where one guy was like, "Can I play the Flash?" And the DM was like, "Yeah, sure." And that eventually became a superhero role-playing game. But at the time, it wasn't unusual to see weirdness, even by D&D standards, show up in D&D. It wasn't unusual to see somebody with a blaster or, whatever. So GURPS took that kernel of an idea that was already there and took point-based, build your own systems like Hero, broke it down to a very simple idea, and then just sort of threw it out there. Now you could play fantasy with GURPS, or space, or superheroes, or whatever, but the kernel of the idea in that those two words, generic, universal, meant that you could also do just crazy riffs, God War type crazy games where you have superheroes and cyber knights and wizards and sandwich sellers and fighting on a star destroyer to try and beat up Sauron. So when it showed up, very simple box, very much following the standard, 2 book, system. Now, and I don't really know why it became so popular so fast, other than the idea of just, I could run anything with this game. And it was a very simple system when it first came out. 3 stats, 3 dice, very, the point-based system was originally not that easy, was pretty easy to understand. Even I, who had a hard trouble with like hero games and other point-based systems, didn't have a lot of trouble with GURPS. Just like 1 point gets me this. If I want it to be better, I spend more than 1 point. And I was like, well, math is hard. I'm just going to spend 1 or 2 points. And I guess I can understand 13 or less. Whatever. Sure, it had the advantages and disadvantages, and the idea that you could, somehow sort of break the system by using disadvantages to get you more points. And then, of course, there were quirks, which got you 5 free points for coming up with things like yawns when he's tired. Oh, that's a point. Doesn't like his shoes untied. Oh, there's another quirk point. I just got 5 points for coming up with bullshit everyday things. Overconfidence. Sure, I'll take overconfidence. I'm an adventurer. Why wouldn't I? If I wasn't overconfident, I wouldn't be adventuring. There's 10 free points. So, yeah, but even then, it wasn't, you could break it, but it wasn't really any advantage to breaking it because the splat books didn't exist yet. So, yeah, and everybody where I was jumped on the GURPS bandwagon like within 48 hours, within the first of us becoming aware of it and taking a look at it. And we already started familiar with Steve Jackson Games because of Car Wars and the Fantasy Trip, and a lot of people like the Fantasy Trip. A lot of people started getting tired of D&D like around that point in time. You know, there were a lot of other new games coming out that were really shifting the paradigm, like Cyberpunk and Vampire, and just, you know, just the fact that you could play other things besides D&D. Really? There are other games out there? And, of course, Champions and Hero games had been around, but a lot of people are like, this game is too hard. And it's too easy to make broken characters. The math in GURPS is easy. I understand it. It's very easy to make characters, and it's very hard originally to break the game. So within 48 hours, I would say, of first GURPS becoming to the group of people I was with at the time's attention, people had converted their entire games to GURPS. Both of the D&D games I was in at the time converted to GURPS. The superhero game I was in at the time, one of the two superhero games I was in at the time, converted to GURPS. The top secret game I was in at the time converted to GURPS. Everybody was converting to GURPS. Everybody was writing their own rules for GURPS. And within a year, people were playtesting GURPS. One of my friends at the time was constantly communicating with Steve Jackson. She even invited him to her wedding. She was so influenced by GURPS that she was writing GURPS fiction based upon the GURPS fantasy game. And she went on to become a semi-successful writer whose origins were from GURPS. Perhaps you've heard of her, Christine Morgan. I don't know. She's written a lot of books. But her original writing was GURPS inspired based upon the GURPS fantasy campaign that she'd been running for a year. So, wow. Within a year, we were playtesting GURPS Supers. I was helping write GURPS Supers and GURPS IST. This was within a year of GURPS first coming out. Everybody who was running Champions had converted their Champions campaign to GURPS, had contacted Steve Jackson Games, found out that Steve Jackson Games was doing a GURPS Supers, and got in on the playtesting. I got in on the playtesting. I got in on the playtesting for GURPS IST. And from there, I helped write, playtest, create GURPS Time Travel, GURPS Supers, GURPS Horse Clan, GURPS Vampire, GURPS IST, GURPS Special Ops, and especially GURPS Martial Arts. Oh my God, just the amount of stuff that went into GURPS Martial Arts. I mean, I love that game. I always wanted to play GURPS. I always wanted, even when I moved away from college and came back, it was like, let's play GURPS. Let's do something with GURPS. But unfortunately, this was about the time that all the Splat books were coming out. And you had the Vampire Horse. Because GURPS Horse Clans, Horse was 100-point disadvantage. GURPS Horror, Vampire was 100-point advantage. Take the two, you can be a vampire horse and get all the powers of a horse and all the powers of a vampire for 0 points. Now, I don't know if anybody actually played a vampire horse, but GURPS allowed you to. And that was when the GURPS began to just become, how badly can I make a broken character using the advantages and disadvantages? Because vampire horse is out there, which means I can do something similar. Yeah. So this is about the time I started having like issues with GURPS and just like, hey, you know, like, I mean, I'd always had issues. Like, you know, even back when I was playtesting GURPS Supers and the fact that there was basically an Aquaman character who could not swim. And their logic was, well, the default swim is based upon his strength, and his strength is high enough that he doesn't need to know how to swim because he's just default swim. And I'm just like, that's not how swimming works. Just because you're strong doesn't mean you know how to swim. It is a trained skill. And scuba is a much more trained skill. And things like be able to fight underwater and do scuba and do underwater combat and do like, you know, 3-dimensional thinking fighting that you would require to be an Aquaman character does require some level of training. Just because you're strong, if I put you in the water, you don't know how to swim. Actually, you will probably drown. And I was just like, just give him 1 point. Just give him 1 point in swimming to justify the fact that he's Aquaman. And they wouldn't. They wouldn't give their GURPS Supers, GURPS IST Aquaman character even 1 point of swimming because their logic was he was strong enough that the default would give him swimming. And again, it's like, no, that's not how swimming works. It is a trained skill. Aquaman knows how to fight underwater. He understands the dynamics of working in the three-dimensional environment that is underwater. That takes years of training to be able to fight at the level that Aquaman can fight. So no, you're Aquaman. So that was the beginning of my with GURPS. And it went further, especially with GURPS Time Travel. And then finally we got to GURPS Special Ops and other things. And they were just like trying to get every license that they could. And this was after the whole GURPS Cyberpunk thing. If you're not familiar with the GURPS Cyberpunk thing, the offices of Steve Jackson Games got raided by the Secret Service when they were writing GURPS Cyberpunk because the information that they were using and the resources that they were using and the fact that they were interviewing actual hackers to write GURPS Cyberpunk flagged them as a potential threat. So, as far as I know, Steve Jackson Games is the only role-playing game to ever be raided by the Secret Service of the United States because they were considered a threat. So say what you will. Way to go, guys. That's the greatest advertisement for your company ever. But I was also, obviously, at this time, also working with Artisolian Games, so I felt a conflict of interest. It's like, I can't do GURPS Cyberpunk stuff and do stuff for Artisolian Games Cyberpunk and do stuff with Shadowrun, especially when Artisolian Games Cyberpunk is better than your Cyberpunk. So eventually I got blackballed by Steve Jackson Games. They told me they never wanted to work with me again, which was fine because at that time I'd also become completely loyal to working with Artisolian Games and was starting to work on Fusion. And I was like, wow, here's a company that did the exact same thing you did, but better and without splat books. GURPS was completely ruined by all the splat books. Then GURPS kind of disappeared. Its popularity waned. All the people that had converted their campaigns to GURPS were like converting back to the systems that they were using before because new versions of those systems had come out, and they were like, well, I could continue running Supers and GURPS Supers, but now there's Bash and Icons and Mutants and Masterminds and all these systems that do that better. So why use GURPS? Even the current version of Champions is better at the time. Mutants and Masterminds is definitely better, and Bash and Icons are definitely better. And just point-based systems generally just after a while don't work because people are just like, it's too easy to break. Where's the fun in having the Green Lantern for 20 points just because you know how to min-max the system? Blah. So GURPS was a system I loved. It holds a very special place in my heart. The fact that our relationship came to an end is much my fault as theirs. The fact that they were just at the time were so stubborn that they weren't listening to the playtesters just led to the fact that our relationship came to an end. It's like people are telling you, no, we want the game like this. And they're like, no. I mean, it goes all the way back to the swimming thing. They were so stubborn that they weren't willing to listen to logic of just that thing. So, yeah. Now I guess GURPS, I don't know what's going on. Steve Jackson Games is now trying to reignite the fantasy trip thing. Maybe they'll return to GURPS. They make a lot of board games now, so who knows? GURPS had its time. It broke the paradigm. It shattered the glass ceiling in a way very few other games at the time did. It spawned hundreds of clones. It still spawns clones to this day. The idea of the build what you want character, the idea of ask question and answers, advantage, disadvantage, being able to build the character you actually want to play, player involvement, player advocacy. These are all ideas that just sort of came with GURPS. We wouldn't have probably had the Forge without GURPS. So GURPS definitely broke the glass ceiling at the time. But then so did Vampire and Cyberpunk. But GURPS is still sort of spoken of, and Vampire is still sort of spoken of. And Cyberpunk, well, Cyberpunk definitely has made a strong comeback, and that is another game we'll talk about at another time. If you appreciate this content, comment down below. Let me know what you'd like to hear me talk about. Until then, I'm your grumpy guide to all things gaming. Subscribe, support. Remember, I'll sell out because I'm a cyberpunk. I'll talk to you later.